13 Action News, live at 6:30.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty.
And thank you for joining us for this special edition of Bridging the Divide roundtable discussion. Just hours ago from Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty in the killing of George Floyd, a historic day today. I'm joined by my co-anchor, Todd Quinones, who's live outside Metro. Good evening, Todd.
Good evening, Tricia Kean. I was out here today listening to Metro Police and their response to the guilty verdict. I think it's fair to say that this country very much breathed a collective sigh of relief after today's guilty verdicts were read. And we thought today is a great day to bring back our panel to have an open and frank conversation really about what this verdict means, but also what this means for our country and also our community now going forward. So I want to take a moment right now to begin to introduce once again some of our panel members. We have Peter Guzman with us tonight, president of the Latin Chamber of Commerce, Steve Gramis with the Police Union. We have Representative Stephen Horsford, who's also with us here tonight, as well as Javon Johnson, UNLV African Studies professor.
And we have Doreen Hall from the Hawaiian Civic Club, as well as Vita Lin joining us from the Asian Community Development. And Doreen Hall is connecting right now, as you can see. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here tonight. I guess the first question would be for you, Congressman Horsford, just your reaction after you heard the verdict read today.
Well, thank you, Tricia and Todd. It's great to be on with the other panelists. And like most Americans across the country that watched the verdict come in, there is a sense of relief that justice has been served. But to be clear, this is not about one officer in one police department. This is about the work that we need to continue to do to make sure that we have police accountability and reform across the country. And that's why I'm working very hard to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act to make sure that we establish national standards for training, that we equip law enforcement officials with body cams, that we eliminate the chokehold and no-knock warrants that contributed to the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and that we institute the other type of reforms that will keep families and Black lives safe.
And so I'm curious, Steve Gramis, when you hear that, first of all, what is your reaction to the verdict? And when you hear about the talk of a possible sort of a federalized police reform initiative, what's your reaction to that idea?
So our reaction to the verdict is that due process happened. Chauvin had a defense attorney. He had a defense put up for him. The prosecution put on a case, and in the end, 12 jurors decided that he was guilty. And that's exactly how these processes are supposed to play out, not in the court of public opinion. And so, former Officer Chauvin is going to have to deal with the repercussions of what he did that day and what took place. To the comments about police reform across the country, listen, I think at LVMPD, we have one of the finest force policies, one of the finest overall policies. We were a trendsetter when it came to policing ourselves under the Obama administration. And so getting people across the country, which I know are not as in depth with what we have here, is good to hear. Of course, there's still some rhetoric about law enforcement isn't appreciated or people don't trust law enforcement as a whole. That to me is always a statement that I don't like to hear, because there's a lot of people that still trust law enforcement, that believe in law enforcement. And as Mr. Horsford said, this wasn't about one officer. This was about law enforcement. It was about one officer. It was one officer doing a stupid act potentially outside of his training, and something that you wouldn't see here in Las Vegas or probably even in the state of Nevada. So this was about that man making a horrible decision and doing things he shouldn't have done. So that's my position on it.
And Shondell Newsom, really quickly, Metro spoke out today. They say reforms are not just procedural, they're cultural changes. Is that happening in our community?
Well, I think to Steve's point, the NAACP has worked extremely hard. I know Roxanne McCoy, the president of NAACP, has worked extremely hard with Metro. But as the congressman said, I just want everybody, for clear context, to understand that we go back to Emmett Till in 1955 in Mississippi with these type of actions. So it's police reform, it's community reform, it's people understanding that Black lives matter. When people ask us, do all lives matter? Well, all lives have mattered for a very long time. What we're talking about is things that have gone all the way back to the Jim Crow days, where Black men have been hurt by citizens and by police and by the community. So this has been a long-standing thing that is not just started with the George Floyd incident. You heard all the other names that were mentioned. So it's a big picture. Police reform is part of it.
All right.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Tricia.
We were going to take a break and continue the conversation right after we take this commercial break. Well, welcome back to our Bridging the Divide roundtable discussion tonight. Relief and a feeling of justice, but this is just the beginning. Many people are feeling tonight in the wake of the guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. It was so emotional today, Todd. I just watched that, like so many people across the country, waiting to hear this verdict and feeling really a sense of relief.
Yeah, I think I could say that there's probably a collective, feeling of anxiety across much of the country, and it leads me to my next question for Dr. Javon Johnson, a UNLV professor. And Dr. Johnson, can you describe how you were feeling this morning versus how you're feeling now after the guilty verdict?
The same, and I think it's really important that when we talk about this sort of collective sort of sigh of relief, that we name who it is that we're talking about. Sure, there are contingents of Black folk who are very relieved at this, but there is still a large contingent of Black folk who aren't relieved by this, who don't believe that the U.S. Justice system has the ability to deliver justice. By what historical standing does it has that capacity? I would argue that it lacks it. I would argue that it's only been made evident by the fact that we just seen a 15-year-old Black girl be murdered in Columbus less than 12 hours after the verdict. This does not scream justice to me. And I get it. I get some police officers don't want to hear it, but more than you don't want to hear it, I'm tired of people being murdered. And it really is kind of that simple, right? And I think, I don't feel relieved. I don't feel a newfound sense of hope in the justice system. I don't feel a newfound sense of hope in the police department. I still fear them. I still am incredibly uncomfortable around the police department and folks who work with the police. And I'm very adamant about that. And I know a large contingent of folks, not all Black folk, because we're not a monolith, but a large contingent of Black folks do feel much the same way.
And Steve Grammis, I want to hear your reaction to that, because there's still very strong feelings of total distrust, and it's understandable.
So I'm never one to put myself in someone else's position and say how they should feel or what they should think, or to the doctors distrust the police and still fears them. I don't know if anyone can solve that for him. I don't know how that gets solved. Maybe as we move forward.
Killing?
What was that?
Stop killing at a disproportionate rate?
Well, I guess your numbers compared to real stats on disproportionate may differ, but at the end of the day, one life lost, doesn't matter the color, is horrible. Whether it's at the hands of police, hands of citizens, when we lose people, it's unfortunate across the country. We look at that collectively, like across the country. What are we doing to each other? Forget law enforcement. I mean, that's what we're talking about. But I wish that you had perspective on police. I don't know, maybe coming out and doing or doing scenarios and you guys go through and talk to them.
I have.
It's a different day and age nowadays, as newer officers are coming on the department that maybe aren't as hardened as folks used to be back in the day, that are kind of filtered out. But at the end of the day, these are still the most noble job that do out there. And whether people consider it doesn't really.
I want to bring in.
But it's also
quick,
that kind of crass response.
I'm sorry.
It's
we
like
just need to
and crass response, but yeah.
We're going to continue this after the break because we have to take a commercial break. I apologize to everybody, but we got to take a commercial break. We'll be right back. And thank you for joining us for our Bridging the Divide roundtable discussion. And Todd, you're live from Metro. And I know you were talking earlier about the changes that Metro has made with the police force. They're talking about reforms not being just procedural, but being cultural as well.
Yeah, and so that sort of leads me to Peter Guzman, who's with the Latin Chamber of Commerce. And Peter, you're someone who's worked closely with this community, the Hispanic community here in Southern Nevada for years, for decades. And so I pose that question to you. Metro Police saying that they have made reforms, they have had major changes in their policy procedures. Do you see that and do you hear that from the Hispanic and Latino community here in Southern Nevada?
Quite frankly, I absolutely do see it. And had a MMAC meeting this morning, of which I'm on the board, right there, right behind you. And I can tell you that we've made great grounds in law enforcement with Latinos, and not only getting them hired on the force. I think we're up 20%, but also in the way that policing is being done. But because my chamber's taking a very, very proactive decision and making sure that that's happening. I just want to say, though, I love America. I love this country. My dad came here so that his kids can have a chance at life, at a good life. And I believe America gives you that. What we saw here today, make no mistake about it, from my eyes, what I saw was jurors, real everyday Americans, got in a room and they made a decision. In my opinion, the right decision. But that was made by real life Americans. That's how the judicial system, that's how trials are supposed to work, with real jurors making the right decision. And today we saw that. That should be, now I know it's not a celebration. I know the numbers aren't anywhere near they're supposed to be. But I'm talking about this case today, because that's what you invited me on for. And today, justice was served by real jurors, real Americans who got in a room and got it right.
And let's hear also, Vita, we want to hear from you, Doreen and Ruben. Let's begin with you, Vita, your reaction today.
Well, my reaction, of course, is I'm glad that this happened. But I also know there's more training to be done. There's more to talk about. And this is just a beginning of showing how important this is. And when it comes to people of color, we are always in that target. Like we also, the Asian community are also fearsome sometimes, right? But I think this, what's going on is actually the right step of saying there should be more training and more involvement.
And Ruben, we'd like to hear from you as well. Ruben.
Again, thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Yes.
you.
Okay, yes, and I'm just here as as an educator in the community. I'm a teacher at Rancho High School, and I want to say one thing, that this is oftentimes we have this sort of understanding that a lot of our young people are disconnected, that they're not paying attention to the broader world around them, to the news. But there are some stories that the young people really want to talk about and really want to have a say in, and this was one of them. It was it began in the summertime, and we began the school year with this trial and this event that took place in the Midwest as a real source of debate. And we had some real conversations in class about race, about ethnicity, about police brutality, about police reform, some real harsh ones too. I mean, you can see that the children, our young people, our high school students really have this on their minds, and they're paying attention. And I think it's a constant reminder to us as a grown folk, as older people, that there's an entire generation looking at what we're going to be doing next. They're young, they're out there demonstrating, they've been protesting, but many of them are not old enough to vote yet, but they're involved and they're paying attention. Just as the eyes of history are upon us as an American people. And I think today's decision, the verdict was the proper one along all counts. There's an entire generation looking at us and waiting for us to make the right decisions. And I think moving forward here, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to reforming our law enforcement policies, when it comes to reforming our social justice practices, when it comes to actually creating avenues for more people to be involved in the process itself. But I'm hopeful, and I think it's, again, an important reminder that there are eyes on us at this moment. And the future is something that we can shape.
Thank you. We have to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Hi there, I'm Tricia Kean along with Todd Quinones, and welcome back to our Bridging the Divide roundtable discussion in the wake of the guilty verdict, Derek Chauvin today. And I wanted to get your take, Doreen Hall, what you felt the moment you watched this happen today, the guilty verdict for the officer in Minneapolis.
Aloha, Tricia and Todd. I do have to agree with Dr. Johnson on this one. I was not relieved. We know that an appeal is probably going to be coming through. We know there's other cases sitting on the Supreme Court that may torpedo this case and cases alike. Do I feel relieved? No. During the trial, and I watched the trial every single day, and I was just in disbelief of the prosecution and defense. And while his trial was going on, back home where I'm from, Hawaii had 3 fatalities, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 19-year-old. I'm scared. I'm raising an African-American son that is half Hawaiian. Am I relieved? No. This process has really educated me on many different ethnicities that I represent as well. So has justice been done? No, we're still a long way from that.
And I'm curious, Congressman Horsford, when you hear that, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, beyond being a representative in Congress, I'm a parent too. And so I agree with Doreen that the trauma that parents wake up with every single day, particularly Black parents. I'm raising 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter with my wife. And we worry every single day about, whether or not they're going to have an interaction that could cost them their life. And that is the trauma that so many parents, particularly Black parents, deal with. And as Shondell said, there is systemic issues here. With all due respect, there was no due process for George Floyd. There's no due process for Adam Toledo, the 16-year-old, the 13-year-old boy in Chicago. There's no due process for Breonna Taylor. And this verdict doesn't bring back their lives. And so I agree with the sentiment that this is just one step. We still have the sentencing phase to ensure that there is full accountability for the murder of George Floyd. And it's why Congress has to pass the George Floyd Act. Part of what we're seeking to do is create national standards to equip law enforcement with body cams so that the video that officers have can protect them and protect the citizens. And I also want to really underscore this point. There is nothing in the George Floyd Justice and Police Bill that defunds the police. In fact, it provides the training and the resources for them to do their job better in working with and for the communities that they serve. Now, we've passed it in the House. In fact, we have Republican support for the George Floyd bill in the House. Now it's in the Senate, and we need them to do their job. I'm a member of the problem solvers, and you're talking about bridging the divide.
But we are leaving on air. We're going on ktnv.com, so join us right now. I had to get out. Okay, let's continue this conversation with our Bridging Divide panel. And Congressman, you wanted to continue what you were mentioning about the bill.
Well, the George Floyd Justice and Policing bill, we have been working in a bipartisan way with our colleagues in the House and the Senate. Right now, we're working with Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, and Senator Cory Booker on some provisions to get it through the Senate. But I have personally met with law enforcement in Southern Nevada. I have met with community activists. I met with the mother of Jorge Gomez to talk about the loss of her son in order to better understand what I need to do as a legislator. And I just want to close by saying the George Floyd Justice in Policing bill will actually help to protect the profession of law enforcement while holding those law enforcement officers accountable who do abuse their powers or who use excessive force that violate people's rights. There's a way for us to achieve the balance that we need and to bridge the divide that you're seeking tonight.
And
Okay.
Dr. Johnson, I see you have your hand raised, and you hear that, and you think that's going to lead to a pathway of a better approach in dealing with the African Americans and communities of color when it comes to policing?
With all due respect, no. And I certainly respect Congressman Horsford. I, in fact, voted for him, to be 100% frankly honest. But I don't. I mean, we've seen reform effort after reform effort after reform effort. At some point, we have to admit to ourselves that what happens is we dump money into police officers. In policing, we spend more in the US on police departments than almost every other military in the world. If more money equaled safety, the US would be the safest country, bar none. And it wouldn't even be close. Reform efforts have never shown to work. There have never been any major studies that have proven they've worked. In fact, all major studies have proven reform efforts don't work. And to Steve Grommis's point earlier, statistically, Black people are murdered at a higher clip. Sure, more white people are murdered by cops than Black people, but there are significantly more white people in this country than Black people. But if we did it per million, the Black people are murdered at more than twice the number of white people are murdered. And we count the disingenuousness of this conversation is frustrating, right? And I get that people want solutions, and I get people want to feel safe. That I'm with 100%. But there are other folks that we can and should be talking about who are trying to imagine alternative futures. What would a safer world look like? One that is not always resting on punitive measures to solve for social ills. I could go on, but I don't want to take up the bulk of the time.
Well, Ruben, I know you have your hand up too. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, I do want to say this too, and I know that these are conversations we've had on and off air, as a diversity initiative here at KTNB, and I'll say this as a brown man in America who, we catch hell, but our lives ain't gonna matter until Black lives matter, and there needs to be a specific, I think, focus, on this issue of just how, and as historians, and Dr. Johnson can probably speak on this more eloquently than I can. We know as a country, we have had a huge issue with our Black population, our citizens. Even before they were citizens, there's always been an issue here. And these reverberations are even present here in our society today, in our country today. Yes, Black people are killed at a much higher clip than any other race out there. We have a criminal justice system, which I personally believe identifies Black individuals and really deals with them in a different sort of way. I teach at a predominantly Hispanic high school, and we have more Black students who are expelled. About 50% of our students who are expelled from our high school are African American males, and again, who make up less than 10% of the population. There really is an issue here that needs to be addressed and dealt with. And I know that these conversations are uncomfortable, but as you mentioned, we need to have these sort of conversations, though they may discomfort us in a great way. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more so here on news networks like KTNB. Black Lives Matter is coming from a very important place, a deep historical rootedness in our consciousness as an American people. Yeah. And I think that moving forward, we have to have a laser-like focus on the issues of the Black community and just how disproportionately ill affected they have been throughout the course of this nation's history and even before the founding of this country. So with that said, I know that there are other folks who want to tap in on this issue, and I hope we can have a conversation around this matter.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to bring in Steve Grommis again. And Steve, when you hear that and you talk about police reform and police training, what is your reaction when you hear people like Ruben De Silva and Dr. Chauvin Johnson say what they just said?
First of all, I really like Chauvin. I never met you, but I really do I'd like to have lunch with you one day. But so my thought is that everyone needs more training. Cops need more training. Everyone, teachers, training always helps. The folks that don't think so, it is what it is. But our department was one of the first ones to have police officers mandatorily wearing body cams. I negotiated that back in 2016 with Sheriff Lombardo in the department to get it out there, because to Congressman Horsford's position, it also shows that a lot of times complaints against officers are not true. And it protects them as well as it protects the community. Listen, we have plenty of cases where officers on body cam are doing things that are outside of policy and they're held accountable for it. But to Javon's kind of point, I think, like, where do you go? Like, it sounds like people talk about, well, do you not even have a police force? And you know, the defund the police, you know, everyone talks about it and it is what it is. But what do? You want to have unarmed civilians doing car stops? Because that guy in the car, that girl in the car, who may be a felon, who may have weapons on him, who may be running a load of cocaine through town, doesn't care about who that is behind him stopping him. It's some authority figure. So when that subject comes out with a weapon, what does that person do? When there's a suicidal call and a civilian shows up first to deal with it and hopes to help, and all of a sudden it goes south and that suicidal subject starts inflicting injury on the civilian that isn't armed, that can't defend themselves, what do you do? We're all for it. There's a lot of things, whether it's homeless or mentally ill people that we can't help. We're not medical professionals. And to be able to help them is what we all want to do. If there's cops saying, I don't care about that, they're in the wrong line of work. I've been on this agency for almost 23 years. And the day I came on back in 1998 was always for the same reason. It was to help people out and do the right thing. And when people are victimized, to hold the bad people accountable. Today, there was a bad person held accountable. And, you know, there is a penalty phase, and we'll see what happens throughout there. But the conversation does need to continue. And to the other folks' point, it's great of this news channel to be forward thinking, to get everyone together and try and have this discussion, because it is meaningful. It means something. If it's one kid in a high school at Rancho, go Rams, even though I went to Bonanza, you know, if there's one kid that feels bad about something going on with the police, it's worth addressing, because you shouldn't bury those things away. You should be able to talk about them and try and figure them out.
And Shondell, you said something when we were on television that I just want to, you said you feel like you're a hunted species.
Yes.
Yeah, talk about that, because I've heard that a lot from my Black girlfriends who tell me that they're afraid for their brothers and for their fathers to go out, especially during this time with the George Floyd case. They always say that they live with this fear. Will their dad come home? Will their brother come home?
Well, that's been a fear that's been around us for a very long time. And everybody says, well, hey, all you got to do is pull up your bootstraps and become successful and get an education and do all these other things. But one thing you can't shed is your color. You can't shed the color of your skin. But similar to what Dr. Javon Johnson and what Javon was talking about was, we're not all monolith. So I have police officers. My son-in-law is a police officer. My sister's a police officer. So I don't feel threatened in that sense. I feel threatened by society, because society actually calls us a dangerous species. And think about it. What did George Floyd do? He wasn't the guy that was in the church shooting people. He wasn't the guy that was in military gear. He may have, and you know, he was accused of having a counterfeit bill, and he died because of a counterfeit bill. Or you died jogging down the street, or you died. Those things are scary. And I was a George Floyd just a couple of Christmases ago. I walked into a store at the Green Valley District with my wife, and somebody said I was a shoplifter. I didn't make a move like a shoplifter. I didn't touch anything, but they called the Henderson police. And so, to Steve's point, sometimes they're putting police in bad situations. But the problem is not necessarily what the police thought. It was what the store clerk thought of a man who is a business owner, an award-winning business owner. Everybody, and I do everything that I possibly can to portray a positive image. I served this country for 10 years in the Air Force, but I can't walk into a store without being profiled as a Black man and become instantly a suspect. And what did she say? We heard that there was a Black man with a hoodie and they were stealing. Now, how many times have you walked into a place and they said, hey, there's a white man walking around with a hoodie and he becomes a suspect? They would not treat you that way. And we definitely had the conversations about it, but that's why we feel like we're hunted, because we can do everything absolutely right and still be a hunted species.
So Doreen Hall, we haven't heard from you in a little bit, but I want to bring you back in, and you're talking about your children. We talk a lot, we hear about this idea of police representation and police representing the community they serve. So what you see in your neighborhood, in your community, do you see police officers that look like you, that represent your family? Do you think that matters?
Well, great question. No, I don't see any law enforcement that look like myself. But just moving here recently again to Las Vegas, I'm scared. I mean, I don't know what people perceive me to be, right? I'm a Native Hawaiian. I have an African American son, which I'm going to have that conversation with him, the conversation, right? My better half is African American. I'm scared. I don't know what people perceive my family to be. Now, if I was home in Hawaii, I don't feel feared. But then again, there's things that's going on back home too. And I don't know what's going on in the world, but I don't see law enforcement that look like myself, but I'm very neutral. I too have law enforcement in my family. You know, I'm very open-minded to many things, but I think George Floyd has taught me a lot. And again, just watching his trial, all the witnesses, the prosecution, the defense, I was just in disbelief. And I really, to me, and even our community here, we feel fearful. You know, back home, we felt safe. Now being in Las Vegas, I'm scared for my children, for myself. Even if we're law-abiding citizens and we follow the laws, which we do, I don't know what I will encounter. Just like, you know, Shondell said, he was just at a grocery store, as professional as he looks. He was already targeted. Will I be targeted as a Latina? Maybe, right? Will I be caged? Just like Peter says, you know, his people are being caged. I don't know. It just brought me to a more of an awareness living here in Las Vegas and to communicate that to my community here.
There's two issues in the wake of this verdict today. Nancy Pelosi spoke, and there's also been a Raiders tweet that went viral. And anybody who wants to answer this can. I'm going to leave it open. Nancy Pelosi said, and a lot of people on social media are saying this is totally inappropriate. Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice. And then there was this tweet from the Raiders that says, I can breathe 4/20/21, and that's getting a lot of backlash. People feel it's very insensitive. Have you seen this, heard about this, and does anybody have a reaction to this who wants to speak up? Peter, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry about that. So Mark Davis has already come out with a short statement because he knows now that he put out a real dumb tweet. He owned it. He said he did send it out, and he's about to make a formal statement later on, and we'll see what that's all about. But I know he's on it now. So, you know, we'll see what he says.
And in terms of what Nancy Pelosi said, Yvonne, did you have an opinion about that? Did you hear what she had to say? Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice. A lot of people feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's simple. George Floyd didn't sacrifice his life. To sacrifice one's life assumes a certain agency. It assumes that George Floyd made a choice, which he did not.
Right.
George Floyd cried out for his mother, which means he did not want to die, which means therefore he did not sacrifice himself. Chauvin sacrificed George Floyd. The police department that trained Chauvin sacrificed George Floyd. I mean, and that's actually just grammatical law. I actually teach this stuff in some of my classes. We have to understand subject, verb, agreement. Like we just got to, and it's like, yeah, it's really simple. Yeah.
So Vita Lynn,
and that's called the politicization of this tragic incident and that's my problem with, okay, and I would have said this to the congressman, you know, we'll go ahead and pass your federal laws. We know what's going to happen, and you throw a bunch of money at a federal law, and I don't believe very much is going to happen. If it did, then we would have already had immigration reform and cut all that racism out. But see, these things are left to fester intentionally for agendas and political reasons, and it's all disgusting. That's why for me personally, I grew up on 28 Sugar Bonanza. I'm not even going to begin to talk about how things have happened to my father and then on to me. I wanted to simplify it today because I was asked about the case, that the jury, to me, did the right thing today, that the right thing that was supposed to happen as far as a court and the jury system, It worked today. And I just hope it's the beginning of many, 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 many more.
And can I sort of quickly add, because there was a question around whether or not Doreen sees people that look like her within her own neighborhood, and she answered that brilliantly for herself, right? Like, I can't say what Doreen sees, but it really is important that we get off this diversified police train. Statistically speaking, the police department nationally represents very closely the demographics of this country. So that argument of diversifying police actually exists currently right now. Also, to Steve's point earlier, I did take the Citizens Review Board class. I did sit along. I have a deep understanding of, I think, what police officers do, but even more to the point of the defund thing. I am a defund the police guy, and I have been open about that. And Steve said, well, what is there to do? There's a lot. Steve already mentioned himself. We have to admit that police officers are ill-equipped by and large to deal with mental health needs and homeless needs. That's not their job. We treat police officers like a one-stop shop for everything. You all go through like what, a couple weeks of training a year to deal with mental health at most. That's not enough. People train their entire lives to deal with mental health needs. So when people say defund the police, they're saying shift those mounds of billions of dollars that go to the police department annually into other public goods. It would be better put if we look. People with mental health needs are actually more in danger than they cause danger. That's statistical fact. Which means we need mental health crisis teams. We need homeless teams. We need housing. These are things that we could start shifting money to. And that's what people mean when they say defund the police, because those things actually have studies behind them that prove that they actually make communities safer, not just a feel-good moment because we tell ourselves it's the right thing.
And so I'll jump in there. I mean, I have never, ever considered myself a defund police type of guy, and I'm not prepared to say that I am now. But boy, when he puts it that way, let me tell you, it's criminal to have our Metro police officers have to be psychologists, law enforcement people, protectors of our community. It's too much. We should be demanding of our governor and our state to fund mental illness problems and separate. And you got to separate. There's mental illness. There's people coming back from wars with a lot of things going on. Then you have your drug addiction. And we rely on Metro, a police officer who I believe is trying to serve his community. We expect him to solve all that for us. And on top of that, also police 55 million people that come into this town every year. People don't talk about that. Our budget's a little different than other states. Police got to deal with 57 million people coming through here on top of all the communities. It's too much. And a federal law isn't going to solve that. What's going to solve that is us down here.
Steve Gramis, do you agree with that?
First of all, Peter, was that a Goonies reference? Down here. I know that was from Goonies.
Yeah, he got that movie.
Yeah. No, listen, you're absolutely right. I mean, to Javon's point about defunding and even Peter's defunding, it's an investment in a different type of funding, right? We'd love to be at 2.0 police officers per capita per 1,000 to go out and handle the calls and the assistance that the community wants. Someone's breaking into cars in the neighborhood. People are stealing. People are doing this. That's what we want to be handling. We don't like going to a homeless encampment to try and figure out a resource to help them. Now, if we could, we'd love to, but we can't. We're out there for a different type of job. And sometimes when we're out doing those things, it can cause that person to kind of say, whoa, what are the cops doing here? We get it. But there's also that flip side of, okay, so we've established that there's a response team, but what happens when that response team is the only ones that have arrived and things get violent? Now they've got to call someone. So to me, a best solution would be, hey, listen, you got a squad of 10 police officers working graveyard in the northwest part of town. That squad also has a civilian assigned to them that can do X or that can do Y. That's a part of the team. Not taking money from the department and shifting it and adding those. Just add to it. Just bring in more of those people that are experts or specialized in helping them. And so when we're there, they can go, hey, I know what phone call to call to get you into a shelter. I know what phone call to call to help you with some of your medical issues with regards to schizophrenia or something. Because truth be told, all of us take the job to help good people when bad guys are trying to prey on them, that we can be the people that stand in the way, not trying to deal with folks that are standing on the corner trying to get a dollar because they don't know where to eat. You know, I myself working patrol, when I worked out there, I would literally go to some Jason's Deli, Charleston and Rampart. There was always a homeless guy around there. I'd cruise in there and grab food and drop it off. I wouldn't give him money, I'd give him food. You know, what he does with it, I hope he eats it. But the point is that we also want to help the folks that just want help, that don't really want to instigate a violent encounter. And so there is a little bit of reimagining what we look like, but it's not taken away from what we're doing currently as far as enforcing laws, but adding to us and giving us some better resources.
And that's why I'm not for defund police. I'm for funding mental health issues, funding the psychologists that go to that are professionals in this field.
Well,
we need to fund this.
I'm for defunding because I understand how police funding functions. Like part of it for me is, and what becomes really frustrating is that we're not doing the readings, right? Like I'm sounding like a professor. We're just not doing, like, they put the readings out there. We know exactly what goes to militarized equipment. We know, you can literally look it up. You know how many police patrol units they put in areas like Summerlin versus the Northwest. Like this stuff, to LVMPD's credit, it is out there. And I read those annual reports and I'm like, this is quite fascinating. And a lot of what policing is built on is what we call the broken windows theory, which is a discredited neoconservative logic rooted in racism born in the 80s. And we have to then get away from that. So for me, it is not simply adding more money into the police. It is literally asking what other formations can exist, period. And I think that that's a much, like, we know for a fact that statistically police goes out there, like, what is this, the saying, Steve, you know it better than I do, that the largest mental health facility we have in Clark County is the Clark County jail facility, because that's where the overwhelming majority of our mental health needs, community members are. Like, we are literally in a crisis and we continually throw money at it. I mean, if it was simply, I can't say this anymore. If it was simply as easy as give them more resources, the US would be the safest country imaginable, ever existed. They have hordes of money. And I'm sure they don't feel like they have enough, and that's fine if that's what they feel. They have more than most public services, if not, I think every public service.
Steve, do you want to respond to that?
No, Javon's very passionate, and I appreciate that. But truth be told, when there's a person thinking about breaking into cars in your street and cops on dots, whatever you want to call it, and a patrol car rolls by, that guy thinks twice. And maybe someone isn't victimized. Maybe someone isn't missing their stereo in the morning or have their house broken into. Having police around matters. Having resources for police. And to your point, you said it's been done across the country. I can't think of a police department that has an assigned psychologist or clinical physician with a area command that goes out on graveyard and they say, hey, I need you to come over here to help me out with your availability and your resource. But if it's out there, I've never heard of it. That is something that could be useful. We have it for—
There are some.
Some, I'd probably say it's a very small percentage, right?
It's small.
It's got to be helpful though. I mean, because otherwise, what's the alternative? The cop shows. If there's something to enforce, they do it. If they don't, they leave. So to have somebody that could step in and go, hey, listen, I'm in contact with this subject. He's safe. There's no weapons. There's no nothing. He's pretty calm. I'd like you to try and help him. That could help us. So when we're talking about baby steps, there's a baby step to say, hey, what if we look at that? At every shift, at every area command where people are having the most frequent contacts with subjects out in the community, we assign someone that's, one, willing to do the job. There's a lot of people, and everyone can agree. A lot of people will say a lot of things about what they will do till push comes to shove. And then all of a sudden it's, well, I got my other practice. I got my this, I got my that. If we can have them, our cops would love to have a resource out there with them that could say, hey, I'll take over. Let me step in, and let's not make this escalate to something it doesn't need to. Let's try and help this person out.
So I'm curious, Vita Lynn, do you want would you like to see something like that in the Asian community and being able to deal with people where you live in how they relate to those police officers and not having to deal with necessarily an armed trained police officer as we know it, but perhaps someone who's trained in homeless issues and mental health issues? Is that something you think is needed for the Asian community here in Southern Nevada?
So we have been approached to help with the homelessness too, to get homeless, get our community to a home and so forth. Because when it comes to our community, there's a language issue, right? And nobody talks about the homeless in our community because of that saving face and so forth, right? But I do agree that we can't have the Metro be a one-stop for all the issues. And I think fundings need to be more to, like we talk about mental health or the homeless part of some. We have to put the money in the right place and get people trained to do the job, right? And when they come to us to do all these services, they come, can you do this? Can you do that? We try to do the best we can when it comes to food insecurity for our community, when it comes to homelessness and our security, we pick that up. But we're learning at the same time, how can we reach out and help our community at the same time, right? So I think what we have to realize is that we do need more training and services that can help when, especially when it comes to mental health, right? Even that's one program they come to us and say, we're not ready to handle the mental health part because we have so many other issues that we're trying to handle, right? But it comes to the whole part that we can't expect Metro to do everything. We do need to kind of like change when time has changed. Times have changed when it's more mental health issue, especially the pandemic. We have even more issues, right? So yeah, I think that we have to do it right away. We gotta do it now, right? So that's my part.
And Ruben, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have two audios here, and I just wanted to make sure everything was working right. So, the great Frederick Douglass said, it's better to build strong children to fix broken men. And when it comes to this whole issue of funding and where public money is allocated, I'll say this as an educator here in this city, that we haven't taken some basics seriously when it comes to mental health and behavioral issues. I don't think those arenas are funded properly. We know for damn well that education isn't funded on par, in regards to other states for sure. I mean, I'm a teacher, and I haven't seen a real raise in over 8 years. We saw a small one after we decided to dang near go on strike. There's so many issues here that we can address, and I think that funding is one of the key aspects of real and a meaningful reform moving forward. Allocating certain public funding to addressing preventative measures and preventative sort of resources should be having the adequate resources and funding necessary so they could function properly. We talked about mental health counseling and having psychologists and those sort of professionals in arenas. I know Graham has talked about that they're pretty present in the LVMPD. I don't know for sure, but in the school district, we have one school psychologist for two schools, Desert Pines and Rancho High School, two schools that are dealing with significant socioeconomic issues, two schools, again, that are largely Hispanic, but have a high rate of Black male expulsions. And again, this is all connected. The school to prison pipeline is a real thing. If we're identifying a certain group of individuals and tying this with race, tying it up with ethnicity, criminalizing these young Black men in particular at a very young age, and creating this sense of social apprehension, but of also criminality and of being bad, apples, I think that's a problem. And there needs to be a reallocation of resources so we can work on the preventative measures before we have to talk about an officer putting the neck on the back of an individual and murdering that individual, in front of the community. I think that is a serious conversation we need to have moving forward. It always comes up. There's always this talk about funding schools, about funding mental health resources, about funding the housing situation here in our state, and we don't get anywhere. If we can't address the root issues, then we're perpetually going to be having these problems down the line. And Frederick Douglass was 100% accurate when he said that it is better to build again strong children to fix broken men. It's better to build a strong foundation than to deal with the issues that come about when that foundation is cracked and not strong in the first place.
And this is why I like this. This is why hopefully Channel 13 will continue this. And when the next subject, when we go from policing to, family values, housing, there's things that are rooted in all of this that actually connect.
Yes.
If we want to have honest conversations. And so we should have these honest conversations if we really want change to happen.
And I'll say this about funding. I think it's all about where the funding is allocated. When I was a kid growing up, the Police Athletic League was big in our communities. Growing up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where they call Bed-Stuy Do or Die, they had basketball camps. The police were there. That's why I think that is extremely important. The Police Athletic League, the DARE programs, all the programs that bring law enforcement into our communities outside of arresting people. So that's big. That is a huge, huge deal. And I know Steve will agree with that. But I also tell you one thing is we still have to deal with systemic racism. And that's the root of all of that. And just like you said, Tricia, that is a known fact that we have to have different conversations with our children. And for me to face the same type of racism when there's nothing else that I'm doing wrong except the color of my skin. I felt sorry for those police officers that had to respond to somebody saying that I'm a shoplifter. I felt bad for them because now this police officer had to I wasn't escalated, so they didn't have to de-escalate, but they had to have a conversation with me that was unnecessary just because I was shopping with my wife. Now, what they did is they talked to the store clerk, and again, this is a societal issue that is bigger than the police department. The police department is picked on sometimes more than any other groups, but it happens in stores. It happens when we walk through stores and we get in elevators. No, we have people clutching their purses. There is no reason why we should feel that way in any part of society. I don't care how big George Floyd is. I don't care how small he was. I'm not a big dude, but why would I look like a threat to anybody? I can walk up to a guy like Steve right now and he probably wouldn't think I was a threat. A person, and the other thing that I think is real important is that and what we got to take from this case, other police officers stood up and said, this was a bad dude. No more blue code. I don't care what happens. No more hiding behind a shield because you feel like this guy's your brother. When I served in the military, if anybody did anything outside of our core values, what we were supposed to do and what we were there to do, we called them out. We weren't hiding those guys.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your time. A quick note before we sign off though, if you're joining us late, we are going to replay this entire Bridging the Divide roundtable tonight at 10 on your device, followed by 13 Action News live at 11. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
guys.
you all. Thank you all. Great
Appreciate
conversation.
everyone. Thank you.
Everybody.